Without a contemplative mind, we do not know how to hold creative tension. We are better at rushing to judgment and demanding a complete resolution to things before we've learned what they have to teach us. I just had to do this episode because there's so much on my mind and heart and in my soul about this topic that it's almost like I just can't shut up. I have to let it out, and I hope that it flows in a way that I sort of see in my mind's eye and kind of feel into, because I know that there might, well, that's an oxymoron. I know that there are women who are struggling likewise, and if you're one of them, I hope that what I'm about to share can edify you rather than frustrate you. We're really in an interesting time on the earth. There is so much information. There's this piece of like all this information, but there's also this piece of transformation that's kind of at the ready as an offering, as an invitation that's being extended to us by God, by the universe, by Goddess in my travels and in my exploration and just really, really morbid curiosity, honestly. I have discovered that this is the time to step up and to really claim our own soul sovereignty. So I hope some of the things I share, because it might be a little controversial, and I recognize that, but I'm less concerned about shaking things up. I'm more concerned about validating and giving rise and perhaps words to what some of you may be feeling but can't put your finger on. A lot of what I'm going to share with you comes from a very incredible teacher, Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. His book, Falling Upward, I learned about while I was on a Sacred Mary Magdalene pilgrimage in France last June. And I was with a group of women I did not know. There were about 8 of us. And we were from all walks of life. I was definitely the youngest one. And a lot of them had kind of gone through different faiths and churches and spiritual paths. And they were kind of trying to arrive at what they felt and thought. And me coming from a very, traditional, very orthodox background, they had too, but of different denominations. Anyway, one of the women I was talking to told me about this book, Falling Upward, which is a spirituality for the two halves of life. And she mentioned Richard Rohr and some of the things he taught and who Jesus actually was, which really, as I climbed into it, didn't really conflict with much of anything I knew before, other than he was a revolutionary. And Christ was a title, not the name he was born with. He took on the name of his father, Joseph, but his title, Christ, was hard-earned. And so anyway, I think it originated actually with Carl Jung. And in my psychology studies, he was always my favorite. Everything he taught was very spiritual in nature, and I felt like had more of a holistic base in terms of looking at the whole person and not compartmentalizing or segmenting the soul from healing and from the psyche. So anyway, this first and second half of life, that's Jungian psychology, and it's also something that Richard Rohr extrapolated on in his book. And I literally have this entire book, like 3 different colors of highlighter pens, written in margins in black and then blue ink later. Like, it is the most marked up book I've ever read. And I've read some really cool books because I'm a voracious reader and researcher. But I think the reason that this resonated so much is because of where I'm at in my life. I feel like having just turned 50 on January 2nd, I started to notice, I would say within the last maybe 5 years, there was a shift happening within me. I kind of started to notice some distortion. It became stronger and stronger and stronger until finally at the age kind of climbing into turning 50 and really my whole 49th year last year was just a whole falling apart. And one of the things that he talks about in this journey of leaving the first half of life is that transformation is more about unlearning than learning. It's about releasing what you thought you knew and deprogramming and deconstructing and asking and probing and questioning and challenging, which is sometimes we're not always encouraged to do that because we're kind of programmed to fall in line and obey and accept and have faith. But powerful faith, I'm learning, is more about going deeper and looking at what might not be so absolute. So this whole thing about absolutism and being black and white and, right, wrong, good, bad, evil, righteous, whatever that means, I wanted to know more about. I wanted to explore that because I started to see in my travels I've been to every continent in the last year except for Antarctica. And I've noticed in all of these cultures that there's this underpinning of the soul wanting to be liberated, of needing freedom, wanting to have this unity consciousness and universality around connection. And the more that we separate and the more that we say we're more special or more elite or whatever, it just was clunking with me. And it wasn't just my own religion that I felt like I was programmed with that way, but it was across the board. So most of the other people that I met in all of these varying traditions and backgrounds, religions and what have you, they kind of were taught that their way was the best way and that what they'd been taught was the truth and the only truth and nothing but the truth. And that if we were all just to ascribe to their ideologies, their fervor and their zeal for this, knowledge and look no further. And that's always kind of like, and especially within the last year, just did not feel right to me. And so I started to ask more and explore more. And with the first and second half of life, it's like the first half is a task. And what I mean by first half of life and what he talks about when he separates those two is the first, it doesn't really have to do with the advancing of years. It could, but it doesn't mean that like when half of your life is lived, you're going to go automatically into the second half of life. He said sometimes people never leave the first half of life because they stay in a very comfortable, quite honestly, it could be a very beautiful existence. They don't challenge the status quo or the cultural norms or what they were born into or anything like that. And so that first half of life is all about building a foundation or what he calls a container. It's your identity formation. And if you don't have a strong first half of life built, a moral compass, a guide in how to treat people with tolerance and kindness and compassion. And if you don't have an understanding of rules and laws, especially spiritual laws and how they work, it's really hard to transition into that second half of life. But the second half of life is not just about the container. It's about the contents of your container. It's about what you are meant to hold, sort of like moving into potentiality and doing what you came here to do and be. What I think is beautiful is there's safety and then there's mystery. And mystery is where I feel called. It's that place where, and I think in religion we call it grace, but it's not something that's explainable, but it's kind of going into the hero's journey, into the unknown, holding your container or that first set of experiences you had in your first half of life and kind of putting them to use. So mysticism is something I've studied for, the past 5 or 6 years. And all mysticism is direct experience with the beloved or the divine. So there's reading about it and longing for it to happen in the next life, sort of pining for that, or even just being comfortable around waiting. But then there's direct experience. So for me, when I was reading his works, it felt like the first half of life is the learning and the foundation and just that safety net, getting the basics down. And then the second half moved into direct experience. There was a monk named Thomas Merton, and he pointed out that we could spend our whole life climbing the ladder of success and find that when we get to the top, we're kind of leaning against the wrong wall. So we get capped. We get to the first half of life, and it's almost like there's a ceiling on our progression or a cap on further exploration. It's also said that there is a rite of passage when you go from the first half of life to the second half. And it's usually a very marked life experience or maybe compounded series of life experiences that take you down and you descend into this place of not knowing. For me, I can honestly trace it back to Stockton, California in late 2013, early 2014, when I was in a 1-bedroom apartment for 5.5 months with my little foster baby, Emma, who I was trying to get full custody of and adopt. And I had to leave my other 4 children at home in Utah and was only allowed to come home on a court order. And I was in the murder capital of America, sequestered, sort of chained, almost imprisoned, almost having to look at the reality of life and what I could control and what I couldn't control and the brokenness around me. And I guess I always had this kind of airy-fairy view of what it meant to stand in a holy place. I thought that as a follower of Christ, that if I just stayed in the right places and I didn't, cajole with certain types of people, or I didn't go into certain places where I could get deceived and all of those things, that I would be safe. And that was the ideal. But in this particular life experience, I was forced into a situation where I had to be with people who were of an unsavory, even dangerous nature. And it kind of plunked me into a dark place. It was for a good purpose. I was trying to bring a baby home, but there was an 18-year-old girl murdered 3 doors down from me. Someone tried to break in the middle of the night. I developed a lot of fears, and this is very typical, I guess, of this rite of passage of moving in from the first half to the second half. You enter what's called a dark night of the soul, where you lose control. Everything you thought you knew is being challenged, and the way you look at life, the way you look at people, the way you look at what you were taught. So it was almost like I was being, kind of thrust into this new way of trying to look at Christianity, my identity, family, that mystery of losing, failing, falling, suffering, why some people have to suffer more, why people are in broken homes. I remember going into children's shelters and I had to go into the bathroom. I thought I was going to throw up because I was taking on all of the pain and suffering of all these children in these cubicles, having to be torn away from their visiting parents who were in recovery or who were trying to get their act together. It made me think about, if Christ was there, would he be going to the religious people? Would he be wining and dining with people who were leaders or had an established record of success or who had a lot of knowledge? And it's like, no, he went to those people who were suffering, who were dripping with disease, and who actually were the outcasts. Jesus as the revolutionary, that's, I think, when I started to first really internalize that. He talked about the last becoming first and the first becoming last. And then I'm thinking all of these things around my identity as a woman and my own feelings about the patriarchy. And that was actually secondary to just understanding what holiness meant. The way of the wound is kind of what it's called, this rite of passage when you move into the dark night of the soul and you unlearn the things that you thought you knew and the structures start to crumble and you're going down, but there's something inside of you that knows that you're on your way up. And it's different than a traditional mistake or sin or weakness in the sense that you feel upheld. You don't feel like you're compromising yourself. You feel like in some respects you're being upheld and that somehow on the other side of that loss, there's renewal. If you want to follow in the footsteps of the revolutionaries, you have to learn how to do it differently and challenge that status quo, not in a way that compromises your moral compass or ruins your relationships or your health or hurts people or yourself. And Christ talked a lot about the kingdom within. And for me, that's always been so intriguing. Almost like this idea of home being metaphor for the soul and the body being a temple and a kingdom already being here. And I was like, what does that actually mean? So again, the first half of life is the container. The second half of life is the contents of that container. If you try to skip that first part of the journey, you're never going to see how wonderful and full the second half of life is. And I wish I could say I'm fully in. I'm kind of in transition. I feel like I've been given, and he talks about this in the book, you can't even create this for yourself. You get to a certain place in the first half where you feel like you've hit a wall or a ceiling, or you need to go outside and explore more, but you feel a little capped. And so of necessity, your soul sort of attracts new experiences, people, trainings, books, teachers, whatever, that bring you more when you're ready. But if you don't have a desire for it, if you don't have a desire to climb into the mystery or to find the full expression and you feel more of a comfortability around just doing the way it's always been done, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that I seem to be meeting so many other women who share in my thirst and hunger and real craving, honestly, for more. He says here, the very fact that so many religious people have to so vigorously prove and defend their salvation theories makes one seriously doubt whether they have experienced divine mirroring at any great depth. And what he means by divine mirroring is kind of what I was talking about with that direct experience. It's like we are like in this narcissistic place of like trying to get all of our needs met and making it all about us. And this need to protect our identity and prove it and defend it and all those things. But, it's like, who are you actually? Who you are it transcends religion. It transcends your relationships. It transcends thought and looking good to ourselves and other people. That's kind of like being on the very bottom of like survival versus thriving. Or if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom, he has the survivalistic basic needs. Once those needs are met, you sort of go up through the top, which is self-actualization. Richard Rohr says that most of us are trained to be in more of like an adolescent culture. That's the larger socio ideologies right now, like in media and whatnot. And sometimes he says religions need to make truth claims that are so absolutely absolute. And we can't really comprehend how it can be more than the black and white. He said, many church sermons I've heard my whole life never seem to move beyond this first level of development or even challenge it. In fact, to challenge it is called heretical, dangerous, or ill-advised. And he's not talking about anything other than moving beyond survival there. He said a high percentage of people never get to the contents of their own spirituality, their own identity, or their own lives. This idea of transcending, not just worshiping the status quo or protecting your ego position and your community position and what's familiar. If you've ever studied Joseph Campbell, he talks about this hero's journey where everyone has to leave the familiar. I think about some of the stuff in Disney like Moana and Brave and even Smallfoot. They're all talking kind of about this new shift of, hey, if we're ever going to heal as a people and a consciousness, if we're ever going to be one, we have to move beyond what's familiar. I liked this. Albert Einstein said, no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused it in the first place. And then Richard Rohr adds to that, God moves humanity and religion forward by the regular appearance of such whole and holy people. Those at deeper or higher levels beyond you invariably appear wrong, sinful, heretical, dangerous, or even worthy of elimination. How else can we explain the consistent killing of prophets, the marginalization of truly holy people as naive, the rather consistent racism, self-protectiveness, and warlike attitudes of people who think of themselves as civilized? In context around that, he's just talking about the steps and stages that you go through in your own development. You can only stretch yourself to comprehend people who are just a little bit further ahead than you are, and to jump from like seeing a Joan of Arc or a mystic who is having a direct experience with the divine, which there have been many saints and sages throughout history who have. That's a huge stretch for us because we don't feel like we have that same maybe destiny or calling or authority. A lot of this just living in the first half of life issue, it's where most people are in any culture. He talks about these early adopters who are sort of the pioneers in looking at the distortion and going, I can accept this part, but this other part, it feels really misaligned for me. I'm not anti-religion. I hope nobody is getting that right now. I just think, I have millennial children and they're an interesting phenomenon. They've been teachers to me in what it looks like to be tolerant, fight for the vulnerable, less emphasis maybe on just like rigorous obedience or orthodoxy and more about really getting to the heart of truth and compassion, looking more at Christ as this risk taker who tried to bring people together and never gave direct answers to questions. It wasn't that he was side-skirting, but if you look in scripture, every time he was asked a question, he spoke in paradox. He posed inquiry right back at them and got them to look deeper than what was just right in front of them, more than just the black and white or the right, wrong, or bad, good piece of it. He kind of ventured outside that mainstream culture in terms of like just doing things because everyone has always done it that way. He was always pointing the finger of what was wrong in churches and religions, and he really did call out abuse of power. And by him saying, that we have the kingdom within us, and there's many layers and levels to which and metaphors we can look to in his teachings, but for me, it feels like it was a call to inner authority. And of course, if you don't have charity, you don't have anything. So establishing through the first half of life the importance of having love and charity and an eye single to something higher than you, to God. And that authentic God experience, it feels like it could be just too much for some people. I go through seasons in my life where I'm like, yeah, this is amazing, studying the beloved and having that direct union, and monks and monasteries and cloistered communities who really were just these, sort of evolutionary contemplatives who really, really sought for nothing other than to have that union. They just pined for it, and they wrote about it. And they were always kind of bucking up against earthly man-made institution, system, or structure that told them they didn't have the right to do that. Blessedly, they had the first half of life that gave them the tools and the resources and the ancient texts and the scriptures and the prophets and the teachings. And then they moved on, and they had their own private chamber experience. And that's why I love to study the female mystics like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard and Teresa of Avila, and all of these women who were really so spiritually mature and seasoned in their approach to the divine. They were culturally shunned. They were shunned by their superiors. They were ridiculed. Sometimes they were burned or otherwise killed for their beliefs. In the first half of life, there's an emphasis on really strong, sometimes rigid boundaries. Again, that container, special rites and clothing and memorizations and formulas and programs and policies and all these externals and badges and ranks and checklists and flags and all these things. And they do serve that container capacity, but they aren't the contents. And so moving into containing that mystery and permission to explore that and move beyond externals and go into the inner world of direct connection with the divine. He talks, I don't know if you would call it an analogy or metaphor, but he said early stage religion is largely preparing you for the immense gift of burning this inner experience of God, as though creating a proper stable into which the Christ can be born. Unfortunately, most people get so preoccupied with their stable and whether their stable is better than your stable, or whether their stable is the only one holy Catholic and apostolic stable, that they never get to the birth of God in the soul. There's no indication in the text that Jesus demanded ideal stable conditions. In fact, you could say that the specific mentioning of his birth in a manger is making the exact opposite point. Animals at least had room for him while there was no room for him in the inn. I just love that. And he said that, being a priest for 40 years, he found that a lot of the pastoral work of churches is ineffective at the level of real transformation because there's a lot of passivity. It's like a superior and an inferior relationship, like a parent-child relationship. So it's almost like there could be a dumbing down or a repetition of the message, and people get bored. And so they don't feel like they have permission to learn more, or maybe they feel a little bit capped, not just rinse and repeat the same rhetoric, but to actually take the training wheels off and dive into more. And so it's a sacred dance. And sacred being the operative word, we can't compare our own spiritual journey or path to someone else's. It has nothing to do with worth. So wherever you are on the spectrum of self-exploration and soul evolution has nothing to do, any level of enlightenment has nothing to do with individual worth. That's solid and intact. But to grow and progress, we have to leave the familiar and keep it in its place and love it and appreciate it and extrapolate from it what we need. But oftentimes the hero or the heroine's journey is a sojourn of solitude. It's a leaving of the familiar and can feel like a death, honestly. You hear a lot about like faith crisis or faith transition. He addresses this even before it hit more of a mass exiting of millennials, because they are really leaving organized religion. Looks like it's 2011 that was first published. So here we are, 8 years later, and we're seeing that there's a kind of a trend right now with this emerging generation. They're very disillusioned with religion, especially religions that are corporate and have less with the people and are more ordered or hierarchical and kind of regimented around practices. So Jesus wasn't, Richard Rohr calls, religiously settled. And it feels like that's kind of what's emerging in the consciousness, is an unsettled mentality or something that doesn't feel quite like they can't really land into it. They're not being fully fed. And they feel like they'd be a little scandalous maybe if they ventured away or outside. Let me read this one to you. He said, when he first calls his disciples, Jesus is talking about further journeys to people who are already happily settled and religiously settled. So when he was calling his disciples, they were already kind of happy and settled and living good lives. And even though it was humble success, they have had some modest success and they were good people. And I'll continue here. He said he's not talking about joining a new security system or a religious denomination or even a religious order that pays all your bills. He said, it's very surprising to me that so many Christians who read the scriptures do not see this. Yet maybe they cannot answer a second call because they have not completed the first task. Unless you build your first house well, you will never leave it. To build your house well is ironically to be nudged beyond its doors, leaving that collective like teenage psyche sort of status quo and moving fast forward into grace, knowing grace has you and that far be it from you to like fall, that you have to, you have to, because those old agendas at some point seem to be insufficient and need to fall apart within you. Again, first half of life, laws, traditions, customs, authority, boundaries, good containers, goodness. We need law in some form. We need to have strong containers to hold the contents that we'll be diving into in the second half of life. And sometimes they're paradoxical and sometimes they're contradictory. Again, Jesus taught in parables. He also taught in paradoxes. So you could almost dispute everything that was taught by one prophet from another because, again, nothing is ever absolute, especially as it relates to the soul. And one of my most prominent spiritual teachers on my path, a former Buddhist monk, Nithya Shanti, who I actually interviewed in a former episode, and he taught me that God is very nuanced because he meets every single person where they're at right in the moment, no matter where they are. I remember reaching out to him when I was in that little apartment in Stockton, and he taught me that if you're not choosing to go into the darkness, but it's just happening, that is how you know the divine is there. At some point, the level to which you ascend will be equal to or greater than the level to which you've had to descend. These things do transcend law. They transcend tradition. They will transcend for you anything you've ever read because no one's had a path like you. We do need people who have gone before us. We need the elders. We need the goddesses. We need the mystics and the people who wrote about these things to give us that clear direction. Those people who've been on that hero's journey, because there's a tension. There's like a life tension there. We want to do God's will, and we want to be part of a community, and we want to be accepted. And sometimes those two things contradict each other, which sucks. But, he talks about it's almost impossible to be transcending or kind of rise above the norm and not be rejected or scorned. There's a reason why it says a prophet is not without honor in his own country. It's because they've had to do something that went beyond the existing paradigms. This is another thing he says. I have seen many Jews, Hindus, Buddhists do it very well, but very few Christians have been taught how to live both law and freedom at the same time. Our Western dualistic minds do not process paradoxes very well. Without a contemplative mind, we do not know how to hold creative tension. We are better at rushing to judgment and demanding a complete resolution to things before we've learned what they have to teach us. This is not the way of wisdom, and it is the way people operate in the first half of life. So interesting. in this day and time, especially in the Western world, we have a lot of programs. We have prisons, and recovery groups, and trainings, and therapy programs, and all kinds of stuff for the really educated, secular and then religious, and all kinds of sophisticated things. But you know what? We're all depressed. There's so much depression. There's so much soul disconnection. And because we're trying to move into less of a traditional mentality, because there was nothing traditional about Christ, we have to be less rigid. We have to not be so risk adversive and climb into just this whole trust. He also says this: Western people are a ritually starved people, and in this are different than most of human history. Even the church's sacraments are overwhelmingly dedicated to keeping us loyally inside the flock and tied to clergy, loyal soldiers of the church. There is little talk of journeys outward or onward, the kind of journeys Jesus called people to go on. So for me, it made me stop and think, when I was to take up the cross and follow him, or walk on water, or leave my home of origin, or father, mother, whatever that parable he taught, he said, you have to leave the familiar. You have to love him more than you love your reputation. So it's that inner critical voice that kind of has kept you safe. Richard Rohr really calls this out, which to me, it really rings true, that we can't hear the real voice of God if our inner critic is so strong about staying in rigid structures. He talks about actually a loyal soldier, which we all have, like in the first half of life, we want to be almost like a military type of obedience and literalism and absolutism and adherence to authority that's external and just a real loyalty there. But he said, paradoxically, your loyal soldier gives you so much security and validation that you may confuse your loyal soldier's voice with the very voice of God. If this inner and critical voice has kept you safe for many years as your inner voice of authority, you may end up not being able to hear the real voice of God. The loyal soldier is the voice of all your early authority figures. His or her ability to offer shame, guilt, warnings, boundaries, and self-doubt is the gift that never stops giving. Remember, it can be a feminine voice too, but it is not the still small voice of God that gives our power instead of always taking our power. So again, I know this is a little controversial when I feel into it and I look at paradox and I look at, my own structures and the beauty that I've taken from them and how they've served me, but then again, how I have felt capped. And also just this deep longing to have direct experience and to find my own inner authority. I can scarcely think of anything more right now than reclaiming my soul sovereignty. I no longer seek external sources to validate who I am. I crave inner authority. I seek first the kingdom, or you could even say the queendom of heaven within. And I've just got no more desire to give my power away. And I actually physically grieve that I gave my power away in the first place. I guess I've entered the second half of life, full force, head on, racing towards reclaiming my identity. It's ironic because my personal brands are Stand, Speak, Shine, and Soul Essentials. And I've been doing workshops for women for years, but it feels like I'm on a divine tutorial of the feminine as just this newborn baby girl. It's driving me, it's compelling me to share with women like you, men like you. If there's men listening, I know there are. But to try to put into words what I'm experiencing at that stage of my life isn't adequate here. I feel like I was asleep to so many things, mostly to the voice of my own soul, my own knowing. I'm trying not to be angry at myself or those externals or wall myself off, which I have tendency to do when I'm trying to sort of nestle in and learn and get to the next phase. But I honestly just know that I need to be in the fire so I can get through it. And this burning that is referenced as you sort of transition from the comfortable and the safe and the home, venturing into the unknown. And it's such an adventure. So Richard Rohr said, when you first discharge your loyal soldier, it will feel like a loss of faith or loss of self. But it is only the death of the false self, and it is often the very birth of the soul. Instead of being ego-driven, you will begin to be soul-drawn. Most mythologies include a descent into the underworld at some point. Jesus, as we said, also descended into hell, and only on the third day did he ascend into heaven. Most of life is lived there, as it were, on the first and second days, the threshold moments when transformation is happening, but we did not know it yet. So I love that. And then I'll just close out with St. John of the Cross. He taught that God has to work in the soul in secret and in darkness, because if we fully knew what was happening and what mystery, transformation, God, grace will eventually ask of us, we would either try to take charge or stop the whole process. I don't know if this is affirming for some of you. I certainly am not trying to be a heretic. I'm also not going to apologize either, because I feel in my soul the truth of venturing and leaning towards the mystery instead of the absolute known, which there's very few things, if any, we absolutely know. And just moving forward with that quiet working of grace is really where I'm feeling called. And honestly, it's why I started this podcast, because I have been so blessed by the stories and the hard-earned wisdom and beauty from the ashes that I've witnessed with so many different women and men on my path that have taught me to get still, to know who I am, and know that I am divinely held and supported, and that no matter what, it's all going to be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end. So thank you for listening to my ramblings. This was largely unscripted. I just have had the Falling Upward book in front of me as I've kind of been going over some of my highlights. I recommend it to those of you who feel like you might be in some kind of a transition. And it is healthy. It should be celebrated, not shamed, because you're moving forward into a new world, new vistas, new opportunities that await into your soul's evolution and expansion.